I still really enjoy the movie, but have to admit there are some things that kind of stick out at me and make me scratch my head. When I was little, I wasn't familiar with all the drama that took place when making these two movies. I just thought this was the way it was always supposed to be, and I had no idea why some of the stuff played out the way it did. There are some things in the film that just make it a bit confusing. There were always little things that bothered me, like I could never figure out why sometimes Lois looked really cute, while other times, not so much. And why did Lex Luthor sound different sometimes?
Each one totally dedicated to corruption, violence, and evil. Wait, that explains the 3 alpha waves I've been getting on my black box.
But there were also some major things. The film sets up these great major problems for Superman to overcome, and he seems to conquer them way too easily. His mother, and that's another thing that I could never figure out. What's his mom doing here? The poor guy is yelling for his dad, Zod is constantly talking about him, but we never see Jor-El. What's up with that? Anyway, his mom tells him once it's done, there's no going back. Then next we see Supes pick up the green crystal, and he gets his power back in the next scene. Alright. Speaking of powers, there seem to be a lot of new powers being branded about. We see beams shoot out from their fingers, there's levitation and disappearing, and everyone knows the big S cellophane trick. Things just start to come out of nowhere with no explanations. The first film established Superman's powers, but now we're getting new ones all of a sudden. It's not like we saw young Clark practice throwing his plastic S insignia in the barn. Could Ursa throw giant versions of all her badges and medals at Superman? And how about this? Superman kills. I never liked that. Especially after his mom says,
"And as you know, we had no death penalty."
Sensible enough.
oh, well, now I guess it's alright after they destroyed Mount Rushmore. It's like the film rushes to the final resolution, despite whether it's staying true to the character of Superman, or the logic the film set in place. Like the notorious amnesia kiss. Superman, seeing how much emotional pain Lois is in, wants to alleviate it, and he does it by wiping her memory of his secret identity. I never heard of that Kryptonian trick. I like the scene between Lois and Clark. They're both really good in it, but the kiss comes off as a desperate way to just end the scene and put everything back in place once again. For most Superman fans, this was a version of the film that they grew up with. Despite some lapses of logic or continuity, and some weird surprises. Like, who's this bald guy? It still was able to maintain a level of quality that was a fitting follow-up to the first Superman film. As time went on, I soon became more familiar with the behind-the-scenes stories of Superman, and learned what eventually happened. Initially, Richard Donner had signed on to direct a mammoth Superman production that would eventually be released as 2 separate films, with a cliffhanger bridging them together. Changes started happening when the ending for the second film, Soup spinning the world backwards, was used as the ending of the first film, because the studio thought it looked really cool. This always seemed crazy to me. How could they expect that using that ending wouldn't paint themselves in the corner when it came time to wrap up the second one? It just seemed really nutty. It would be as if they told Peter Jackson to use the volcano ending in the first Lord of the Rings, because it really looks neat, and we'll worry about coming up with another ending for that one later. Donner had managed to hold on to his directing duties up to the release of Superman in 1978, and had been shooting the sequel simultaneously up until him getting canned by the producers for whatever reasons. This left a vacancy for a director and still some portions of the sequel to be filmed, which is where Richard Lester came in. From there it becomes a whirlpool of confusion as to who filmed what, who decided to add or cut scenes, or whether Lester needed to shoot a certain percentage of the film to get a director's credit, or if the Salkins wanted more humor in it. I have no idea. I'm not even going to try to figure it all out. The final result is what ultimately counts. Over 25 years later, Richard Donner got his opportunity to put together his original version of Superman 2. Now, I'm not too big on alternate cuts of films. Sometimes a new director's cut of a film can be an improvement on the original, and adds some worthwhile scenes into the story, while other times it just seems like a cheap way for a studio to repackage a product and double-dip fans to buy a new copy of it. But I generally don't get too worked up over new versions of films. Like, I love Blade Runner, but I can't even keep up with how many versions there are of it anymore. I think every single person who worked on that film gets a chance to recut their own version of it. But I was always curious to see what the Donner cut would do for Superman 2. And after watching it, I'm now convinced firing Donner was a huge mistake, and they should have just stuck with their original guns on how to tell the story in these two Superman films. The story is basically the same, but it's told in a much more sophisticated and dramatic fashion than the original version of the film. Like any good sequel, having already established our characters in the first film, it can hit the ground running and start setting up the story, which is what the Donner cut does much better than the Lester version. The film starts off with the cliffhanger that we originally were going to have. Superman throwing the Hackensack missile into space, it blows up and breaks the Phantom Zone. We don't have to take that detour to Paris to set up the bomb and it detonating, releasing Zod and the gang. In the first scene at the Daily Planet, Lois is immediately suspicious about Clark being Superman. She hurls herself out the window, thinking Clark will change into Supes to save her. This scene plays out pretty much the same way as the Lester version does, with Lois jumping into Niagara Falls, and Clark managing to save her, but maintaining his secret. The great thing about the Donner version is that we don't have to wait 45 minutes to see Lois risk her life to prove her suspicion. We jump right into it. Again, this B-story gets streamlined and starts up immediately. One of the biggest improvements in the Donner cut is the return of Marlon Brando as Jor-El. At the time, Brando filmed all his Jor-El scenes, but refused to have his scenes used for Superman 2 unless he was paid some more cash for being in the second movie. I gotta say, Brando might have been a great actor, but at this time in his career, he seemed like a real pain in the ass. Since the first film set up the whole father-son relationship, with Jor-El back, it improves all the fortress scenes here. Jor-El was the one who was teaching his son, Superman's only link to Krypton, the one he goes to for advice. So it was kind of weird to suddenly see a Kryptonian bald guy show up. When Superman gives up his powers, it's a much more powerful scene with the head of Brando looking on. I also love the touch of Lois wearing a Superman t-shirt here. That's another thing I really loved was Lois's discovery that Clark is Superman. Instead of the Lester version with Clark tripping over the pink bear head and falling into the flames of love, here Lois is much more proactive with solving the mystery, and demonstrates some of her wits when she manages to trick Superman to drop the Clark Act. Even though it's a patchwork of different film auditions and the continuity is really all over the place, the scene still works really well, and it makes me regret that a real version of it was never filmed with the actors. With the world seemingly doomed, and Clark now powerless, heading back to the fortress to try to correct his mistake, is once again improved with the addition of Brando. Unlike the Lester version where Superman finds the glowing crystal, picks it up, and is suddenly back as Superman, I suppose we're supposed to assume that something really interesting must have happened off screen, but we just don't get to see it. Here we see the consequences for his impulsive actions, and the steep price he has to pay for not having listened to good old Dad. We get to the same place as the Lester version, but again, it's much more interesting and told in a more dramatic way. Jor-El, in a final selfless act, uses his last remaining energy to give his son back his powers. I mean, really good stuff. Really good stuff. Fans who have seen the Lester version numerous times through the years and are really familiar with it will notice a lot of smaller tweaks made throughout the Donner cut. The final confrontation at the fortress is again handled differently with Donner. Those strange powers I was talking about, well, they're gone. Supes still defeats Zod the same way, but this time Superman killing him is rendered somewhat moot by the big spinning the world backwards finale. After having lost his connection to his father, Superman destroys the fortress and relegates himself that he and Lois can never be together. And it ends as it was originally intended, with Superman spinning the world back and setting everything in place as it was in the beginning. I take it Superman's motivations for doing this is mainly keeping Lois from learning a secret. It's not as heavy a reason as trying to prevent her death, as this device was used in the first one, but essentially it's the same reasons as the Lester amnesia kiss. But it does work pretty nicely here, by also putting Zod back into the Phantom Zone. He doesn't end up killing him. All that is all kind of a bonus to this, and puts everything back where it's meant to be at the beginning of the film. One odd inclusion after all this is Clark showing up at the diner and dishing out some payback to that mean Rocky the truck driver. After turning back time, the original pummeling that Clark got from Rocky should never have happened. So it kinda just looks like Clark shows up at this place to pick a fight with a guy. It's too bad that the Donner cut doesn't really fit with the original Superman. They have to function independently from one another, and you have to watch it with the knowledge that the Donner cut is a close presentation of what Donner originally wanted to do. If you don't watch it with that in mind, you'll just think that Superman spins the world backwards anytime there's a problem. I always loved Superman 2, but after seeing the Donner cut, the changes that were done when Lester was hired are much more evident and appear to be bigger miscalculations than before. Some of the decisions made didn't help make telling this particular story any better. I thought the Donner cut was a huge improvement on a film that I had known for 25 years. Not to take away anything from Lester, he sometimes gets a bad rap by fans saying he ruined the film, putting in too many corny jokes and stuff like that, but I don't think he deserves such a lashing. It's not his fault that Brando didn't want to return, or Hackman refused to work with him, or that the Salkins decided to use the second ending for the first film. It looked like he was already walking into a madhouse. He's nowhere near the Joel Schumacher category of ruining superhero films. These first two Superman films are the ones I grew up with, and like most fans who grew up with them and watched them over and over and over again, they became a huge part of my childhood, and they quickly became two of my favorite films when I was a kid. They stand right alongside those other big movies during that span in my life where they really felt larger than life and had a major impact. It sounds kind of corny, but they weren't just movies, but experiences. It's a strong personal reaction from a movie that I've rarely had since. I remember hearing all those stories of kids who, after seeing the films, were convinced they could fly and ended up jumping out of apartment windows and dying and stuff. Anyone else remember those stories? Maybe they were all just urban legends or something, but I do remember hearing about that stuff. To this day, when I think of a live-action Superman, the person that I inevitably conjure up is of Christopher Reeve. In fact, most of the actors in these films have become the flesh and blood representations of those characters in my mind. There have been a bunch of actors since who've played Superman, Clark Kent, Kal-El, but it's kind of hard to compete against the first guy you saw in your life wearing that outfit, especially when it was Christopher Reeve. I'm guessing the kids who grew up watching George Reeves' Superman, when they finally got to see Christopher Reeve, their reaction was probably like, "Who's this young punk in a cape? Nah, that's not Superman." Fortunately for Reeve fans, two films wasn't going to be the end of his career as Superman. The 1980s were just getting started, and before the decade would end, fans would get two more Superman films. It wasn't likely we would be seeing Richard Donner direct another Superman film again, but they were something to look forward to. And there was no reason to not expect they wouldn't maintain the quality the first two films achieved.
You know, we'd always worried during the production whether we'd succeeded in bringing Superman to life. Because making people believe that a man could fly wasn't really the hardest part of making the film. I mean, we all know that Superman can leap over tall buildings, but the question is, could he leap over the generation gap since those early Siegel and Schuster days? We wanted to know if a man from the innocent 30s could survive in the post-Watergate 70s. Well, thanks to all of you, he's doing just fine.
General Zod does not take orders. He gives them.